Hey, Katie. We have The Clue of the Broken Locket. We are on chapter 16, Directions to a Treasure. As the woman's scream died away, Vince Driscoll set the twins on the ground and looked upward at the house. The four girls followed his gaze, but could see no one at the windows. Who had screamed? Mrs. Driscoll? Or someone else? Instinctively, Nancy's eyes turned toward the bullseye window. Was someone imprisoned in that room? Vince now grabbed the children and rushed them into the house. Bess was so indignant she forgot to be fearful. "That's downright cruelty to children," she said. "I think we should stop it." Nancy and George and Cecily agreed, but George cautioned, "If we antagonize the Driscolls now, they'll never let us come back here." The girls continued to speculate on the woman who had screamed. "It might even be that red-haired girl," said Nancy. "Then she certainly can't be in league with the Driscolls," said Cecily. "Oh dear, I wish we could help her and also find out if she is Susan Wayne." Nancy was thinking the same thing. She put in words an idea which had been in her mind for some time. "I believe the twins are the key to some mystery involving the Driscolls. The red-haired girl knows it, and they don't dare let her get away to tell it." The others were speechless at first. Then George said flatly, "I believe you're right, Nancy, but what can we do?" Nancy felt that, for the present, the girls should continue their search. George suggested that since they were not far from the house, they might look again for the iron bird. She pointed to a part of the broken stone bench, partially covered with weeds. "This place evidently was a garden at one time," she said. "Some ornamental bird might have been standing in it." Cecily was eager to follow George's hunch, so the girls, trampling the tall grass, pulled up matted vines and kicked aside small loose objects to see if they were concealing any object. Nancy had just pushed another stone out of the way when the toe of her shoe hit something hard. She leaned over it and saw that it was a protruding piece of rusty metal. Excitedly, she dug around it with the heel of her shoe. The other girls came to assist. George found a stout tree branch and began to use it like a spade, just like a shovel. Finally, the girls were able to pull the object out of the ground. It was a tall, graceful iron flamingo. "The iron bird!" Cecily exclaimed, gazing at the rusted ornament. The other three girls were excited. "Do you think the directions to your family fortune are inside it?" Bess asked Cecily. With almost loving care, Cecily ran her hands over the neck and body of the bird. She failed to find any kind of opening. "Let's try the legs," Nancy suggested. There was no indication of an opening on the legs themselves, but under the bird's foot, the young sleuth thought she detected where a section had been soldered on. So it was used like hot metal to close the section. "We can never get this piece off here," George stated. "Why don't we carry the bird to the cottage and work on it?" Bess wondered about the advisability of taking the ornament off the property, but Cecily assured her that if it contained something belonging to her, she had every right to remove it, at least temporarily. So the four girls lifted the heavy iron flamingo and carefully descended toward the trails of the woods. "Whew!" said Bess. "This weighs a ton. I wish the boys would show up and help carry it." The three youths, after an unsuccessful search of the grounds, had returned to the cottage. When they saw the girls approaching, they ran out to greet them. "For Pete's sake, where did you unearth such a thing?" Dave asked with a grin. "Out of an underground passageway?" Nancy laughed and told the story. Cecily added that they wanted to pry open one of the bird's feet. "We're exhausted," said Bess. "How about you muscle men doing this little job?" Removing the soldered wedge was a rather difficult task. Finally, however, the boys did accomplish it, and Ned reached into the small opening and pulled out a piece of paper folded over many times. When it was laid flat on a table, it proved to be a fairly long letter. Cecily began to read aloud. "From Simon Delaroy, your brother." Cecily looked up excitedly. "This is my great-grandfather, William." She continued to read. "I am afraid Maryland will be involved in the war, and that I know is coming, so, for reasons of safety, I've decided to divide the family fortune into two separate halves. If someone outside our family should find one half, the rest of the family will at least have the other. My dear William, your share I am putting in the corner cupboard in the kitchen. Besides money and some securities, I am also including the family silver. This is what I have done. Broken our mother's locket in 2 halves and sent half to you. Perhaps the locket will prove to be a talisman, and though the worst may happen in the next year or so, some day the 2 halves of the family may find each other again. We fear that mail from the north will be opened, so I have enclosed only a brief note about the fortune in the locket. By the way, I have hidden my portion of our family treasure in the beach house because that is a place very easily concealed. As Cecily finished reading, everyone began to talk at once. It looks as if your mystery will be solved, Cecily, said Bess. And if this record racket is cleared up too, you and Nico can get married. Cecily beamed and said nothing would make her happier. But I'm completely puzzled about this beach house, she said. We haven't seen any here. What do you make of it, Nancy? Nancy shook her head. An ordinary beach house most certainly could not be concealed. This must have been a very special kind. Maybe we can find clues to it. The young detective said she also wondered why anyone would choose a cupboard for a hiding place. That, too, must have been a very special one. Why don't we just march up to the lodge and look for it? George proposed. After all, Mr. and Mrs. Carl Driscoll haven't invited us there, and even if that Vince doesn't want us around, apparently he isn't the boss. Nancy was eager to follow this move. It will give us a chance to look for that girl we think is Susan, she said. If she is working for the Driscolls, she ought to be around the house at some time. But if she is their prisoner, the sooner we do something about it, the better. By now it was almost supper time. The girls fixed a simple meal. The group ate quickly, then set off once more to Pudding Stone Lodge. When they reached it, the house was in complete darkness. No one answered their rings or knocking. Maybe they have left, Bess suggested. If the Driscolls are crooks, they probably suspect the police are on their tail. I hate to think of those poor twins being dragged off, Bess sighed, especially by such awful relatives. The young people waited a while, but the place remained dark and silent. Finally, Nancy said, We'll have to come back in the morning and see what we can find out. The others agreed. They had had a long, hard day. As soon as they had eaten a snack at the cottage, the boy said good night and left. Before she fell asleep, Nancy's thoughts again turned to the twins. A hunch came to her. It's fantastic, she admitted to herself. I won't even tell the others until I'm sure. When the group assembled the next morning, Nancy announced a plan for trying to find out whether or not the red-haired girl was a prisoner at the lodge. Cecily was to play a prominent role by standing at a distance in sight of the house and pretending to be the other girl. Nancy would try to work things out so she could call the attention of the Driscolls to Cecily. The girls synchronized their wristwatches, then all but Cecily went off. Part of the plan was for the 3 boys to remain hidden on lodge grounds and trail anyone who came out of the house. Nancy rang the front doorbell, and Mrs. Driscoll came to answer it. She looked surprised, but readily admitted the 3 girls. How are the children? Nancy asked, smiling. Oh, they're fine. They both love it here. The woman did not offer to let the girls see the twins, however. We heard a woman scream come from here yesterday afternoon, George spoke up. Was anybody hurt? Mrs. Driscoll looked startled. Oh, I guess you must have heard me. I thought I saw a mouse in the kitchen. They always frighten me. The girls were dubious, but did not continue the discussion. Nancy spoke up. Our main reason for coming back is we picked up a clue regarding the iron bird. Do you mind if we look in the cupboards? I guess it will be all right, Mrs. Driscoll said, but the girls thought she acted rather nervous. She followed them into the kitchen and watched as Nancy opened the cupboard door. Only dishes, glassware, and some pots and pans were revealed. The young sleuth pulled over a step stool, climbed up, and examined the top shelf thoroughly. There was no sign that a secret door or sliding panel concealed a hidden treasure. Nothing here, Nancy said, climbing down. They all walked into the dining room where there was a fireplace. The room had no real cupboard, but alongside the brickwork was a niche in which stood a beautiful vase. "Are there other cupboards downstairs?" Nancy asked, casually looking at her watch. "No," the woman replied. At that moment Carl Driscoll walked into the room. He stared at the girls, then nodded curtly, looking annoyed at their presence. Nancy wondered if they had disturbed some project of his. As if lost in thought, she walked toward the window. Suddenly Nancy asked, "Who's that red-haired girl down on the beach? Do you know her?" The question had an electrifying effect on the Driscolls. They rushed to the window and looked out over the bluff. Cecily was in plain sight below. Now she turned as if heading for the misty edge of the lake. With a muttered excuse, Carl Driscoll fairly ran into the kitchen. The girls dared not follow, but they heard a door close softly, and footsteps pounding down the cellar stairs. Nancy continued to look out the window, and in about 2 minutes she spotted 2 men on the beach, Carl Driscoll and his brother Vince. How had they reached it without her seeing them leave the house? "I'm sure now they used an underground passage," Nancy thought. The men started off on a run toward the misty end of the lake and disappeared around a bend. Cecily could no longer be seen. With difficulty, Nancy remained calm. She was sure her ruse had worked. The other red-haired girl was being held in the house, and the Driscolls thought she'd escaped. Now to hunt for the prisoner, Nancy thought. Ooh.